Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, episode 29 of the Science Dispatch. My name is Cameron English, and I'm joined again by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Very good to talk to you again, Chuck. What's going on?
Not a thing, Cameron. Good afternoon to you.
So this has been a theme lately. We've been hitting your stories because they're pretty popular. People are reading them, and they're intriguing topics. So today we're talking about a new harm possibly from marijuana consumption. And we're going to move on to not a new weight loss drug, I suppose, but a drug that's being used. I don't know if excessively is the right word, but a lot of people are using this for weight loss, even though it wasn't intended for that. So we'll get into the second story in a minute. But first up, tell us about smoking pot and why it may not be all that good for you.
Well, as marijuana has been increasingly legalized across the country for recreational rather than medicinal purposes, there has become a steady drumbeat that perhaps smoking marijuana is not the best thing for you. So this is another in a series of studies that's beginning to look at the effect of marijuana on the population, which is not surprising since up until recently it was not legal, so it wasn't a research concern. So this particular study looked at whether there were findings on chest CTs that could suggest that there had been problems from smoking marijuana. And I think that there were probably at least as many problems with the study as they found on the chest scans. The biggest problem with the study is that they never were able to identify a group that smoked marijuana exclusively. They did identify a group of individuals who, 56 individuals that admitted to having smoked marijuana between 2005 and 2020, in addition to having smoked cigarettes. And they compared that group of patients to another group of patients that had smoked cigarettes alone without smoking marijuana, and then a third group of patients who were having CT scans done for other reasons that were non-smokers. And what they found was evidence of emphysema, a breakdown in the walls of the lungs that made the air sacs larger, that made you hold on to carbon dioxide more, as well as a thickening of the lining of the lung itself, the airways, which made it more difficult for oxygen to be transferred from the air into your bloodstreams. And they found this to be very prominent in both the people that smoked tobacco as well as the group that they identified as marijuana smokers, but were in fact marijuana and tobacco smokers. Compared to the controls, none of the controls had any significant evidence of this kind of chronic obstructive lung disease, which is not surprising. And so they concluded in the end that marijuana, like smoking, did cause lung damage. And I think that that's not an unfair conclusion to draw, even though the categorization of the groups was somewhat amiss. As I've said many times talking about smoking, tobacco or marijuana, it's not a good idea to inhale hot combustible products. And as I always end, if you're not sure about this, ask a firefighter. And I think that what they're getting at is that marijuana, when smoked, can cause similar damage to your lungs as is seen with the tobacco smokers. Did this prove it? No. Would I be surprised if that was in fact the case? Not at all.
So you said towards the end of your story that the study was fatally flawed or something to that extent.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, how did they market it? How did the university market it? Because obviously they're not going to put out the study and go, hey, this is pure crap that we just did. Take a look, right? They're going to try to frame it in such a way that this is an interesting finding that contributes to our understanding of how marijuana affects your
Right.
respiratory health. So
And
what did they say? I'm just curious.
they just categorized the groups. They mischaracterized the marijuana smokers by not stressing marijuana and tobacco smoking, which they said in the actual text of what they were writing under their methodology. But for all the illustrations, including the one that I put in the article, they referred to that group of marijuana and tobacco smokers simply as marijuana smokers. And that to me is it's deliberately misleading. This is one of the kind of things that you should pick up at peer review and say you're going to have to relabel talking about these groups. They did refer to the tobacco-only smokers, but they never referred to the marijuana smokers as marijuana only, because in fact they were not. Nor did they make the point that they were marijuana and tobacco smokers. And I think that right away was the fatal flaw in terms of the science of the study, because they really weren't comparing two wildly different groups. And when you look at the numbers in terms of pack years, the tobacco smokers and the marijuana smokers had very similar numbers of pack years of smoking, and then had marijuana smoking in addition.
Well, that leads to another trouble with the study, and that is it's really difficult to quantify how much marijuana
Yes.
somebody smokes. So for pack years, and maybe you can explain what a pack year is in case somebody doesn't know what that is, but you can relatively reasonably track how many cigarettes somebody smokes, but you can't do that for marijuana. So explain why that's a problem.
Well, I think that President Clinton probably explained the situation best when he said that he'd smoked marijuana but had not inhaled. Um, so a pack year is a relatively straightforward way of measuring tobacco smoking use, and it consists of people that will smoke a pack of cigarettes, 20 cigarettes a day, for a year. That constitutes a pack year. If you smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, then you're accumulating 2 pack years for every year you're smoking. Now that is not an unreasonable measure, and certainly become a standard measure that we talk about in science, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story, because what you really want to know is how much of those hot gases and chemicals from combustion are being retained in your lungs. And that has to do with how deeply you inhale and for how long you hold that breath in. Now, for most smokers, they're not taking deep inhales, except perhaps for that first inhale in the morning. And then they're not holding it in their lungs for long periods of time, because it doesn't change things significantly. It may somewhat enhance the delivery of nicotine, but they're going to get enough nicotine just by breathing normally. Pot, on the other hand, you're trying to maximize your dosage. So in general, people are taking big, deep breaths in, and they're holding on to it for as long as possible to drive that dose up. So the pattern of dosage, again, of just hot gases and combustion products, are going to be somewhat different for people that are smoking pot versus people that are smoking tobacco. And parenthetically, because I know that vaping is a topic that you discuss fairly frequently, vaping is a whole different pattern of inhalation and exhalation, and certainly doesn't feature anywhere near the degree of hot combustion products that you see with smoking. That's one of the reasons it is a harm-reducing agent.
That's a whole nother topic, and it is interesting because, and you've written about this too, that or excuse me, not marijuana, but the vapor from an e-cigarette affects your lungs differently. And you obviously just described why, but that's an interesting question. What seems to me, before we move on, it seems to me that had they pursued this study a little more honestly, perhaps is the right word, and they just would have said, we're looking at, the synergistic effect of tobacco smoke on marijuana smoke, and we're going to see how this affects respiratory health or lung health, what have you, compared to a control group that doesn't smoke either of these products. It seems like that could have been a reasonable study. It wouldn't have been too hard to design and recruit people.
No,
Yet they didn't do that. So I'm wondering if that would be worth pursuing, because that seems like an interesting research question.
I think that it's an interesting thing to pursue. I think that there are other populations outside of the United States where they have people that smoke marijuana chronically. I want to say in a stereotypic way. Let's talk to our Bob Marley Jamaicans. And I think we'll find a population of people that smoke marijuana exclusively. And then those people could have the same kind of CT scans, and you can get better data on these things. But this was, as with many things, a little bit of a study of convenience. This was done based upon information that could be readily obtained and analyzed. And just to presage something that I'm going to write about in the next week, there's a report out this week that a whole host of studies of marijuana have shown that it is not good for pain relief. And that has been what the media has focused on. But the actual article was not so much on the fact that marijuana was not good for pain relief, but that the media always put a positive spin on those articles, or to a large degree put a positive spin on those articles. So I think that the way the media picked this up is no different than it picks up other discussions of marijuana and health. It tends to, I don't know, poo-poo would be the right phrase to use, but it tends to downplay some of the risks of chronic marijuana use that we're only now beginning to see as it becomes one of the recreational drugs of choice in the country.
Yeah, that is striking. We've talked about it before. It just sounds like in one direction or the other, we like to bullshit ourselves. It just depends on, whatever
Yeah.
agenda is in question. We just, it would be better if we would just say, we just kind of like getting high and we don't see the problem with it. So let's start with that and then move forward.
Exactly.
Instead of this noble lie that it's good for pain or it's good for glaucoma or whatever. I don't know. It doesn't matter. In any case, so let's talk about losing weight with drugs. This is becoming a bigger phenomenon these days. So tell us about this story called Ozempic Goes Way Off Label.
Right. So Ozempic is a semaglutide. It's a drug used for the treatment of diabetes because it simultaneously reduces your blood glucose by stimulating your insulin secretion. That's parenthetically why it's only good for patients with type 2 diabetes, not type 1. And it also slows the emptying of your stomach. So it leaves you feeling full and not requiring any additional food. And the combination of those two is shown to be very effective in lowering blood glucose and maintaining patients with diabetes in a good treatment range. One of the effects of these medications became apparent during the phase 2 trials when they were testing it on human beings, not so much for safety, but for efficacy. And they noticed significant weight loss in patients with diabetes as well as in patients that were obese. And as I suggested, this is one of those serendipitous moments when the scientists at Big Pharma realized that they also had a opportunity here to develop a weight loss drug. And in fact, Ozempic is marketed under the brand name of Wegovy, which is its identical medication for weight loss. Now, the manufacturers of Wegovy went to the FDA and presented studies of the effect of this drug on weight loss alone and received approval for using this as a weight loss drug. Ozempic, on the other hand, was taken to the FDA and approved as a drug for diabetes, so that they have different indications. And if you look more carefully at the labeling for both, the dose of Wegovy necessary for weight loss is slightly higher than the dose that's given for Ozempic. So what's happened is in the influencer communities and the Hollywood communities where weight control is problematic, these drugs are being prescribed way off label. Well, at least Ozempic is being prescribed way off label to people to use to bring their weight down, because it will bring your weight down by a significant percentage in a relatively quick period of time. So for the person that's able to afford $1,500 for an injection, this is a easy weight loss solution.
It definitely is easy to a certain extent, but you point out some details that I think help people balance the risk benefit equation. So we're talking about for both types of the drug, I suppose we could say, you're looking at weekly injections at a cost of at least $1,000 a month. And the side effects, they're not terrible, but they are pretty nasty, So I think it's like gastrointestinal distress and diarrhea and vomiting or nausea at least, so these are unpleasant. So and I guess I should also add that the weight loss was significant. So I think for the study in the New England Journal of Medicine, it was like 15% of your body weight. So if let's say you're 300 pounds, that's like what, 40, 45 pounds of weight loss. Yes. So it is substantial. But talk about, you're the physician here. So talk about this risk benefit calculation that people need to go through.
Well, so on the benefit side is clear. Let me add a little bit more to the benefit. The only other options in terms of weight loss is dieting or bariatric surgery. And I think what we're really seeing is the treatment wars play out between a medical management with a medication versus a surgical management with bariatric surgery, because these two modalities far and away surpass the effects of diet on controlling weight for people that have significant weight issues. So the medical side has finally found a treatment that works in the same range as bariatric surgery, which has really transformed weight loss. So that's on the benefit side. The downside is that once you stop the medication, about 2/3 of the weight loss returns. So once you start on Wegovy, if you're using it truly to maintain a lower weight without changing any of the other qualities of your lifestyle in terms of exercise and the quantity and quality of your diet, then you're going to be on this medication forever. And at that point, the cost of the medication starts to rival the cost of bariatric surgery, and again, is something that an individual with a weight loss problem would want to factor in terms of making a treatment decision. Now, all of this really applies to people that do not have diabetes, because there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that the use of these kind of medications in a patient with diabetes does provide an additional health benefit by lowering their weight and reducing their cardiovascular risk a bit.
Okay, so one thing that stuck out to me, as you mentioned, is people regain something like 2/3 of their weight if they went off the drug and they just sort of reverted to their old lifestyle. So does this study in a roundabout way, or this research that's been done, does it sort of point to the fact that people do indeed have some sort of a genetic set point for their weight, or some sort of a, like a baseline for metabolic health that they're birthed with?
I don't. It's certainly the discussion never gets around to that. There's certainly, again, to my mind, some type of set point that our body is comfortable with that is probably an accumulation of factors, including genetics and the food that you grew up with, and whether you were overweight or not overweight as a child, how active um, you are. So that there's any number of things I think that go into creating a set point. Though I do think that people do have a set point, and they tend to drive themselves back to it over time. Ozempic is getting used more by people that need to have a quick weight loss, so they can fit into their clothing for a photo shoot, or for some social occasion, or just to feel better, rather than using it as part of a prescribed treatment for obesity. Wegovy, on the other hand, because it's designed as an anti-obesity medication, is probably more likely to be used by patients as part of an overall plan that does include other lifestyle changes, as I suggested, in terms of diet and exercise.
Man, that
The other thing that I found fascinating at the end were all those commercials
yes.
featuring Queen Latifah.
Yes, talk about those,
God
please.
bless her, you know, and that while a lot of the demand for the Ozempic has been fueled by social media influencers, to the point that there were actual shortages of the drug for patients with diabetes. Um, the big pharma has made use of the fact that the FDA allows commercials to educate the public on diseases, to run these series of commercials involving Queen Latifah. And basically, they're all designed to talk about the fact that obesity is a disease. It is not something to be ashamed of, that you would be not ashamed of any other medical disease you have, and that in that setting, Wegovy or any of the other medications might be part of a healthy prescription to make your health better. And, in part, they seem to be run by patient advocacy groups, but the patient advocacy groups are heavily supported by the makers of Ozempic and Wegovy, which happens to be Novo Nordisk, a company specializing in care of diabetes.
So there's two things here. So the first, the point about people using this to get down to their fighting weight, if you will, for a photo shoot, or so they can look pretty in the picture. And I don't know. That's really, really dangerous, just to have people motivated by such short-term goals, because you're not fixing the root issue. But that goes to the way the drugs are being marketed. And I was watching these ads, which you include in the story. They're on YouTube, and they're just so obnoxious. And I think what bothers me the most is that they're being framed as, people shouldn't shame you. You're the victim here, and here's a drug that can help you with this problem that you've developed through no fault of your own. And we've talked about this before. Maybe in some cases that's true, but I think by and large, and your comments earlier sort of speak to this, is that there are things that you do or don't do that contribute to your weight gain, even if you are predisposed, or even if you've grown up with, in an environment with poor eating habits. There's still things you can adjust that can improve your metabolic health and help you lose weight. And so I find those ads really annoying. And to a certain extent, it's predictable, because as we've talked about, there's the fat acceptance movement out there. It's gaining more traction. And so this message of, you're born fat, you live in a big body, but you aren't a big body, blah, 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 blah. Like that message is more common. And so it's pretty predictable that you would have drug companies pick up on that, because that's a great way to sell your product. Like, this isn't, it just
Right.
happens, man. Now take this pill and we're going to fit, it just bugs me. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have no problem with less body shaming. I don't think that shaming people into caring for themselves works particularly well. I think you have to have a different uh, internal motivation for that. And I do think that it's true that the FDA has allowed this loophole for education to increase consumers, not even patients, consumers' understanding of health problems, and big pharma has driven themselves right through that opening as big as they can. I mean, there's all these new diseases that they'd never mentioned in medical school that now have an underlying treatment that are getting advertised on television. We have thyroid eye disease, which is part of thyroid hyperthyroidism. I recognize that. But now that there is a treatment, there's now a specific area, thyroid eye disease. My favorite of late is vasomotor disease, which is a new term for the hot flashes from menopause. And once again, if you go to the website, you'll discover that even though it's shrouded in patient advocacy and helping people learn things, that behind it is a manufacturer that's all too willing to share with you the details of the best pill to help you out with the situation. And it would be interesting to see people's responses if they were trying to get us to buy tranquilizers in the same way to resolve our stress.
What a great comparison. Look, man, stress happens. It's not your fault. Take this horse tranquilizer. It works. Like, that's great, because that would never be allowed. Everyone would break out in hives. Everyone. But so let me say a couple things as we wrap up here. I don't want people to be shamed either. As I've said, I grew up the fat kid, and I know how uncomfortable and how miserable that can make you feel. But I think we're talking about two extremes here. The one extreme is putting people down, insulting them, shaming them for the way that they look. Obviously, that's very, very psychologically damaging in many cases. But on the other extreme, you have the victim mentality, right? The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, where you can acknowledge how cruel it is to mistreat somebody, but at the same time, you can recognize that they do have a real problem and they do need help. Where you can say, look, your dietary habits, your exercise habits or lack thereof, these are a problem. I'm a dietitian, I'm a physician, let's work together and let's get you back on track. And if you're in a situation where a surgery or a drug can help, then by all means, I'm going to prescribe those for you. That's great. I have no problem with that. But what I'm hearing you say and what I read in your story is that's not necessarily what's happening. You have people using these recreationally is the wrong word, but they're using them for vanity purposes primarily. And that's what I'm concerned of as someone who struggles with my weight, and just as someone who's concerned about health, public health more generally. It seems troubling to me.
It is troubling to me. And the piece that I really didn't get deeply into, but it is in there, is how physicians use drugs off-label. I have used drugs off-label. There's no question that that's something that can be done. But in this particular instance, prescribing a drug so that somebody can lose a few pounds for a week or two, I'm having some ethical concerns that isn't the kind of off-label uses that we should condone. But I don't know where that particular line in the sand rests. I just know that for me, prescribing Ozempic as a weight loss drug is on the wrong side of the line. I would be just as happy prescribing Wegovy, same drug, but it meets all the indications, and there's there's a body of proof to show that its effect on weight loss, and as a physician, I can talk about the trade-off, the risks and benefits, specifically with that drug with respect to weight loss, rather than confounding it with talking about weight loss and diabetes. Just as a thought.
Very good. Yeah, another tricky situation where there isn't a clear answer. It's almost like lesser of two evils sort of a context. There's just not a great way to deal with it. I mean, even if you know what the right answer is. So we'll leave everybody with that. Maybe you can think about it. Maybe you have an answer and you can comment on one of Chuck's articles. But in any case, if you want to get these stories that we're talking about, you just go to our website. It's acsh.org. Click on the subscribe tab up top, punch in your email, and then 3 times a week, we will send you our Science Dispatch newsletter. And then you read the stories, and when you come to the podcast, you'll go, oh, I know what they're talking about because I read the article. So we'll be back next week with episode 30.
All right.
Dear Lord, Chuck, 30 episodes of this podcast.
God bless us and Tiny Tim.
There you, there you go. All right, everybody. Have a terrific week. We will see you next time.
Take care.